the recording now so I don't forget. Okay.
The picture of me is about 15 years old.
Oh, well, you look wonderful. You look wonderful now, too.
Dude, could you?
So once we start, it's better if you mute. I'll mute also, as you can hear. I've got some background noise, and then just remember, though, if you want to speak, you have to unmute. But you can always chat, and Nancy and I both can see it, so you can always do that. Okay, so it's 7:13, 2 minutes, we'll start. Okay, so I hid the non-video participants. I don't know if that did it for everybody, but that's something you could also do so you could more easily see everybody who has something to see. Okay, it's 7:15 according to my cell phone and my iPad, so let's begin. I think people will still be joining us. We have 17 on now. We should have about 26. So I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Nancy Hartshorn. I'll just tell you a little bit about how we met. How did we meet? We met,
We met at Apple Hill.
At Apple Hill in 1996. Nancy is a singer and I'm a clarinet player, and Nancy is from Michigan, but her brother-in-law was one of the directors of a chamber music program, and we were in the same group together. I was not married, I didn't have kids, but I started to learn all about inclusion from her. And we stayed in touch over the years. I think we only saw each other once since then, but it happened to be at a very important time. It was just days after I signed off on a self-contained placement for my son who was entering kindergarten. And she came to New York to present at a psychological conference, and the APA, I think, or AMA.
It was NASP.
NASP. And she left a whole day free for me. She skipped out on her meetings because she had a lot of work to do. She had to educate me on the huge mistake I was making. And I didn't listen to her because I thought she didn't understand New York City and she didn't understand the options that I had. And I just didn't listen because I wasn't ready, because I thought my son would do best in a self-contained setting with other kids with disabilities. But her words stayed with me. I went home right that night and I told my husband we might be making a mistake. And then September came and we saw very quickly that we indeed had made a huge mistake, at which point I emailed her and she called me right back within 5-10 minutes and laid out some options. And we went to work and actually relocated to put my son in inclusion. So I've learned a tremendous amount from her. So it's really exciting to share, my first teacher with my students. So maybe we'll start, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences with inclusion and how it's affected your family and your son.
Okay. So my son is named Jacob, and he has something called charge syndrome, which results in being deaf and visually impaired. So he's considered deafblind. He has balance problems, pretty severe communication problems. He's still incontinent. He's 27 now. So he's got very severe disabilities. And he was in a self-contained classroom up until age 5. And then I went to a conference with my sister, Melissa, called TASH, the Association for Persons with Severe Handicaps. And going to this conference was like going to a civil rights rally. There were so many people there with severe disabilities who were just fighting for their rights. And this organization made a lot of things come about in the law. And so I came back from that feeling kind of quote unquote saved, you know, and we decided inclusion was the best way for my son, for him to go to his neighborhood school, the regular kindergarten with his non-disabled peers. Even though he couldn't talk, he couldn't walk, couldn't go to the bathroom by himself, he couldn't see. But what I had learned was that the National Consortium on Deafblindness had recommended inclusion as the best placement option for children who were deafblind, because a self-contained classroom, you know, they're not going to learn anything from that, because it's, well, let me just put it this way. The classroom my son was in, a lot of people have nicknamed it the feeders and breathers class. So these are a lot of kids who, you know, spend their day just getting moved around, getting tube fed, getting breathing treatments, and nobody was really doing anything educational with them at all, even though all of them were capable of doing something. Jacob was the only ambulatory person in the room. He crawled, and he wasn't getting anything from being in that class. He was just kind of in a room being babysat and cared for. So he went to kindergarten, and he went to both the red group and the blue group, morning and afternoon kindergarten. So he got everything twice that was happening, which was really good for him. And then he went to first grade, second grade, and third grade, all the way through sixth grade. He went to general ed classrooms with special education support. So he had a special educator assigned to him. He had a classroom aide assigned just to him, who was trained in deafblind techniques. And he had a speech therapist, and he had speech therapy every day. He had a vision consultant, a hearing consultant, physical therapist, occupational therapist, but they all saw him in the classroom. It was all done in the classroom, with the exception of speech therapy. Speech therapy was done separately because he's deaf, and they needed to work, you know, a lot of the things they were doing were noisy, and it was disruptive to the class. So the speech therapist worked on things, and then the classroom aide, not the classroom aide, Jacob's individual aide would work with him during the day on all of those things that the speech therapist had trained her on. Same thing with PT and OT, the aide would carry them out. And so this went really well until we got to middle school, and kind of like Diane's seeing right now, middle schools aren't quite as easy to do this with. You start to get into higher order curriculum, and it's a little more difficult. But our first 7 years were amazing. And you know, that's where we really fought hard for this to happen. And Jacob really, I don't think, would have made the gains he did make at that time if he had stayed in that one classroom. He wouldn't have learned to walk because he didn't have anywhere to walk to. And he wouldn't have learned to communicate because he didn't have anybody to communicate with, and things like that. So he wouldn't have learned to eat by mouth from tube feeding because there were no opportunities to do so in the cafeteria. You know, he was just tube fed and kept in this one room. So just being included, not only did it give him social support, because he has a bunch of friends still that he's known since kindergarten who are all in their late 20s and still come and see him, who became his circle of support through elementary school and just really cared about him and helping him get through. And he supported them as well, because a lot of them were kind of the sort of misfit kids that didn't have a lot of friends. And so they formed this support circle around Jacob, and they all became friends and had support that way. Is that a good introduction?
That's a great introduction. I think it's interesting also because, you know, New York City has been trying, you know, for the past decade or so to become more inclusive. And, you know, a question that comes up all the time is kind of who's included. So now you tell me I'm going to include kids with disabilities. Well, who gets included? And it's interesting to me how that line is different in different places. And unfortunately, we're still not at a place in the New York area where a student with multiple disabilities is they're even speaking about including that kind of.
Well, let me go back then and say that that's still not happening here either. The only reason this happens with any kid with severe disabilities is if the parents really fight for it. Even 22 years later, Jacob was the first person with severe disabilities to be included in an elementary classroom in Mount Pleasant. Several kids followed him. I don't know if that's still happening or not because I'm not a part of the school system anymore, but I hope that he started something that continued. But he did open the door for them to see that, yes, it could be a good thing. But we had to fight for it. It's not something that they offer ever.
Right. It's interesting because when we left New York City, because at that time my son, there was no chance of him being included in a general ed class, and we came out and we went to a bunch of different schools and we found one that seemed especially open. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but I heard soon after we got there, they had never included a child with so many disabilities. And again, my son, he's on the spectrum. He has ADHD, has a lot of language processing issues. He was basically nonverbal when he entered kindergarten. And a lot of the teachers were nervous about it, but the principal was 100% behind it. But since then, every year they take another kid or two who has more severe disabilities than my son did, because every year they see, well, I could do this. So then the district says, well, you handled that kid so well. Now we're going to send you this kid. And now we're going to send you that kid. And now they regularly have nonverbal autistic students who are going through the elementary school. And, my son did learn to speak by second grade, partly exactly as you said, because he had students to speak with. But it really opened the door to other students, which is interesting. So how about, you speak so warmly about friendships from school. A lot of schools, I think, open the door academically to kids with issues, and they're willing to support them. But I don't think all schools do so well at creating community. And that's something that our elementary school did very well too. But do you want to speak a little bit about?
Again, I'm going to say our elementary school didn't do it. I did it. I wish our elementary school would have done it. We put together what's called a circle of friends, a formal circle of friends for Jacob. Kindergarten and first grade, we asked the teachers to look for kids who seemed particularly interested in Jacob, and then we invited them and their parents to a meeting after school. We had cookies and stuff, and we talked about, would you like to be a part of a group that helps support each other and Jacob in school, and just give us ideas of things you're seeing at school that could be done better for Jacob and things like that. So we had about 10 kids join up at 5 years old, 6 years old. The circle of friends wasn't terribly helpful till they got a little bit older. But what we did the first couple of years was we gave them a schedule to be Jacob's lunch buddies and recess buddies. And so they'd sit next to Jacob at the lunch table. And these kids were wonderful. They didn't know that Jacob shouldn't be at their school. This was their first school experience. They had no idea that he wasn't typically supposed to be there. So they just embraced him, and everybody's weird in kindergarten and everybody lies on the floor and picks their nose. So, it's not like they had a lot of social taboos at that point in time. One of the interesting things that happens with Circle of Friends is the teacher generally is supposed to organize it and just have the Circle of Friends meet a recess once a week to talk about supporting the student. I could not get any of Jacob's team people to come to the meetings. They just would not come. The teacher didn't come. The aide would come sometimes, but it was mostly just me bringing snacks and entertaining kids. But some really cool stuff came out of it. For instance, there was one little girl they were in 6th grade, and she was running for student council president, and her posters were all over the school. And at the top of the poster, it said, "Activities I am involved in." And Jacob's Circle of Friends was at the top of the list. And then there was choir, and there was Girl Scouts, and all these other things she was involved in. But that was status, to be in Jacob's Circle of Friends. Other cool things that happened. Jacob was using kind of a chair to feed, to sit at in the cafeteria that helped give him a lot of trunk control because he wasn't sitting up well. And after a year or so, the kids started asking, why doesn't Jacob sit on the bench with the rest of us? It was these cafeteria bench benches with tables connected to them. And my husband and I looked at each other and we thought, Jacob really doesn't need that chair anymore. He could sit fine on a bench. And so from then on, he started sitting on the bench. But that's something we never would have noticed or thought of. So it had to come from the child's eye view, And they knew what 5 and 6-year-olds wanted and cared about. And they invited him to sleepovers, and he, was at birthday parties. He had a big Halloween bash every year, and they all came. They all came to his birthday, and we went swimming every year. And we just tried to make everything an event around Jacob, not to sell him to them, but just to celebrate the community we had. But the school did not support it. And in fact, every year, the school principal said to me, let's talk about a different placement for Jacob next year. Maybe he should go to the school for the deaf. Maybe he should go back to this classroom. And it was just one year she said to me, none of the 3rd grade teachers wants to take Jacob. It was heartbreaking to hear that in a meeting about your child. Then she retired and we got a new principal. And she sat down with me one day and she said, what do we need to do to make this work? And everything changed. All of a sudden, teachers were on board. Everybody was supportive, and we made it work. So I really think that the administrator of the school can set the tone in a big way.
Absolutely. It's funny because we had such a different experience. The elementary school was so constantly thinking of things to do to get my son more involved and more included. And something you said just reminded me of what they did in 4th grade. 4th grade, they noticed, it's kind of a year where the students are getting very cliquey and they're chatting away in the cafeteria. And my son really can't have, even still, he can't have a conversation in a noisy cafeteria because he's just overstimulated. He can't hear what people are saying. So we have a period in the 4th grade class. It was called Drop Everything and Read. It was a 30-minute reading time. And the teacher called me up and said, I just want to let you know that I'm taking that 30-minute period and I'm making it a hangout with Benny time. So she had a sign up where she had the kids sign up for, they would sign up for a week. And for a week, they would spend a half an hour with my son and they could do whatever they wanted. She put out games, she put out a whiteboard, and she said this will take them through March. And initially I was a little uncomfortable. I thought, well, how do the other parents feel? These kids aren't reading. We all need to read. 4th grade is a state test year. And but all the parents, all I heard was, oh, my son is so excited. He's got next week with your son. And then in March, the teacher came to me and she said, I thought we were going to think of something else, but the kids are all coming to me and saying that they missed a day because they had orchestra rehearsal. They had a flu. They had the flu for 3 of the days they were supposed to be with Elon. And in the end, they filled the rest of the year by makeup days. And he found 2 really good friends who he's still very good friends with through that. As I mentioned to Nancy last week, unfortunately, his 3 best friends went off to a private school. So now I'm seeing, here we are in a high school that really doesn't look out for those kinds of things. And, it's a little worrisome because we kind of banked on those friendships. And he still has them. He just doesn't have them in school. But they really went above and beyond, which is why I wrote a book about them, because there were so many instances where they thought of solutions and they thought of ways to integrate him. Even in 1st grade, they had the speech therapist would push in for his speech therapy twice a week. And she made these conversation circles for the half an hour she was in there. And the teacher said it went so well, she started every day with a conversation circle.
Oh, cool.
So they would give pre-made questions, like a little index cards filled with questions. They'd vary them every week or so. And the kids would take turns having conversations around these cards. And also that was a way that he could get to know his peers and they could get to know him. And in a way that his therapy was not something he had to do in isolation. But it's rare. I'm really seeing that the more I visit other schools, much more often the parent has to be the advocate and say, I need a circle of friends, I need this, I need that. And the schools feel burdened by it.
Although one of Jacob's former caregivers, her name is April, she is now a special education teacher. She still works with Jacob on the weekends at his home. She has been hired as an inclusion specialist in a very small rural town north of us in Michigan. And she doesn't have a classroom time. She just goes in and supports her students in the classroom. Now, these are students with ADHD, they're on the spectrum, they have conduct disorder, they have learning disabilities, but she doesn't pull them out. She works with them. So that school is embracing it and actually hired her to do that. So that's pretty cool. Some things are happening.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to more severe disabilities, it's more difficult because, you know, severe disabilities by definition are rare. And so every school doesn't have the opportunity to even have one kid with severe disabilities, let alone one after another. So it's always kind of reinventing the wheel for these kids.
So I
This is
thought everyone
Jacob's house. Jacob's, in this picture, he's, I think, about 19, but he's 27 now. And these were all his caregivers at that time. Yeah, they're all gone now, but all these people worked with him. We called them Jacob's harem. But these are all the people who support him in his home, and they're all special education majors at the time. They're all teachers now.
So can you tell us a little bit about what Jacob's doing now and how, you know, how he lives in his home and how that came to be? And also a little bit, I know you're facing, you know, some legal battles now with the state.
Yeah. Okay, so Jacob has what's called a habilitation waiver through Medicaid. So we were able to apply for a waiver through our agency that does this. In Michigan, it's called Community Mental Health, that supports people with developmental disabilities. So they helped us apply for this habilitation waiver, and it gives him community living services money. And the reason it's a waiver is because it waives Jacob's need to go to a group home or to an institution. And it waives the use of the money in that way and gives the money to Jacob to live the way he would like to live. And so we've had it for 5 years. It's worked beautifully. He lives in the house next door to us. There was an older lady who lived there, and she was pretty elderly, so even her kids were, you know, retired. And so we asked her kids when she passed away if we could buy the house for him, and they just sold it to us at cost. So that was really nice. We remodeled it, and it's just beautiful. It's perfect for him. So Jacob moved over there, and the habilitation waiver pays for his care. We actually purchased the house so he doesn't have to worry about rent, and we pay all of the utilities, but it's not very much because, I mean, he doesn't even use electronics of any kind. He doesn't have a phone bill because he's deaf, and he doesn't watch TV or anything. So bills aren't too high over there. It's right next door, so we can walk over there. But so the money that they allowed us to have was enough to pay for Jacob to have 24-hour care. And it was just working beautifully, just beautifully. And then last year, they decided to withdraw the nighttime care. They said it was not medically necessary for Jacob to have someone with him while he's asleep. And they offered him something called the Personal Emergency Response System. I don't know if I've told you about this, Diane.
Yeah.
Which is an open phone line where Jacob can go over and push a button and say, I need help. Or they can say, Jacob, do you need help, if they hear him wake up in the middle of the night. And they told us in Jacob's person-centered plan that for the first 3 weeks, staff would teach Jacob how to recognize the voices on the system. He's completely deaf. So here's an example of an agency who's just arbitrarily removing supports. He could never benefit from that system. He'd put it in his mouth, chew on it, and throw it across the room is what he'd do. So we're in a major lawsuit against the state of Michigan and Community Mental Health, and other suits that have been brought against them have won. So have been on our side. There have been other decisions, and so I'm pretty confident that we're going to have his funding reinstated. But it's just been a nightmare. I mean, we are already taking care of a kid with severe disabilities. You know, why do you want to make our lives harder? It's been a nightmare and a lot of legal fees that I hope we get back. And it's, you know, he had this perfect, inclusive, wonderful home in the community. They take him to the grocery store. We live in a small town. It's about 40,000 people when the students are here at the university. And when they take him all over the community, people come up to him and say hi because they went to school with him, or they were his teacher, or they met him in other places, because he's always been included in his community. He's never been just shoved away in a sheltered place. And so often people will say hi to him, and I don't know who they are. One of the recipient rights, there are recipient rights laws that all of his caregivers have to go through a training for recipient rights. And one of the things they're told is that you're not allowed to share any personal information about the person you're caring for. But I tell them, you know, if you go to do you have Meijer there? It's a big grocery store, Meijer. If you go to Meijer and somebody comes up and says, hey, Jacob, how's he doing? I said, you go ahead and you just tell them, because you're his voice and he can't speak for himself. And I don't think you're violating his rights. You're helping him to be included. So, and people always know him. So it's just, this is April. This is the one who's the inclusion teacher now, inclusion specialist.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things he likes to do? I don't think I have the most up-to-date photo, but I love watching him go out to ride his bike.
Yeah, he rides a tricycle. He has an adaptive trike that he rides all over with somebody with him. They often are running behind him because they can't keep up with how fast he's going. But he can't, he doesn't know to stop at the curb and not go in the street. And sometimes he takes the corners too fast and falls over. So he's kind of learning to slow down at the corners now. Wears a helmet. He works every day at this little bellhop type place here that we've had for 75 years in our town called the Pixie. He goes in every 3 days a week, and there are little laminated menus on every table stuck between the napkins. He goes around, he picks them all up, puts them in a tray, and he takes them over and he gets a bucket of soapy water and he washes them on both sides, lets them dry, and puts them back. He fills the salt and pepper shakers. And he doesn't get paid for that because we didn't want to mess with the whole payroll junk for him, because he has Social Security income, and he probably works an hour and a half a week, so it's not really worth it. But what he does is he goes up to the counter after he's done working, and he takes his iPad and he uses his PEX pictures, if you're familiar with that, and he says, I want a strawberry shake, please. And they give him one, and he says, thank you. And so that's, more tangible reward for him than money would ever be. In fact, he probably just earned about as much money as that shake cost. So he does that 3 times a week. He goes to a pet supply store and he gets a carton of dog biscuits and individually puts them in baggies and prices them with assistance. And then he has his own micro enterprise business called Jacob Can. In Michigan, you guys have deposits in New York, right, on pop cans?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know the drill with that. In Michigan, the deposit is 10 cents. It's the only place it's 10 cents. So people don't throw them away. They hoard them, they accumulate them. And often we'll have people come by for fundraisers and say, hey, do you have any pop cans you could donate to our thing? And I'm always just like, yeah, take them. I don't want the guilt of having them here, and I don't want to have to take them back to the store. So Jacob has a nonprofit business called Jacob Can, and it has a logo that was designed by one of his former caregivers, who is now in advertising, graphic designer. And he goes to people's homes. He has a Facebook page, and they can text when they need their cans picked up. He goes to their home. They're friends of his. He picks up these bags that say Jacob Can on them that are washable vinyl bags. And he keeps them in his garage. And then every day he takes 2 big bags to the big grocery store. And, do you have those can return machines in New York?
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
So a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about because they don't have the deposits like we do. But so he puts them all in. He knows how to take the little tag out at the bottom. And then he goes to the self-serve checkout and he scans the tag and pushes all the buttons and gets the money. And then he keeps the money in a little lockbox. And every once in a while, I'll go over there and get the money, and I bring it home and I put it in an envelope, and it's going to be given to the Charge Syndrome Foundation at their conference this summer to go into the fund that helps families get to the conference who have never been there. So he's actually donating all of his time and his money for that. But he's also helping people because people want to get rid of their cans,
Right.
and they know it's for a good cause. So it's a win-win-win situation. But the main thing about these jobs he has is that they are individualized. He does them alone. A lot of what happens, at least in our town, there's a place called Mid-Michigan Industries that people will send their kids with disabilities to who can't get a typical kind of job. And it's like a big babysitting place. It's a big, huge sheltered workshop where they do piecework, put together bolts and screws and make pizza boxes and stuff like that. But they're in this huge warehouse room. It's very noisy and everybody's all together. And it's just really sad. And a lot of people really hate it. And then they get paid like 7 cents an hour or something. And I just said, I don't want Jacob doing that. And there are crews of people with disabilities who go around and pick up trash at the gas stations. And there are crews who work at the police station and do, all the vacuuming and clean the bathrooms. And I thought, not that that's not an honorable thing to do, but as a group, it devalues the group to say only the people with disabilities pick up trash. Only the people with disabilities. And the people with disabilities all have to work together. They can't work in an inclusive setting. So I wanted Jacob to have a job where no other people, not that I don't like people with disabilities, but I just didn't want him to be grouped together that way. I want him to be seen as an individual.
Mhm.
And yes, it's not hard to see that he has severe disabilities. It's not like they're going to make him look any weirder than he already looks. But I think he has pride in the things he does. I mean, he gets those big grins on his face when he's done with work and gets his shake. And I think he knows that what he's doing, whether he really understands that those are menus or whether he's gotten them really clean or what the cans are, he has pride in his accomplishment, I think.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's really, as you said, it's inclusion at this level in the same way that you fought for him to be included in elementary school. This is the way that he can be included in society today.
Yeah.
So I think we already kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's a good question that we came up with. What do you think about, again, when I go around to different districts and I do a lot of observing and visiting in different places, I'm really shocked by the differences, even by a few miles, certainly out on Long Island, in terms of who can be included in one district and who wouldn't be included in another, or who would be included half a day, which isn't really inclusion at all.
Right.
And what do you think about, and I think it's interesting, even at the elementary school my kids went to, they have a line, and kids with Down syndrome or kids with, it's interesting. They seem to be including more of the kids with autism, but they seem to have this thing about kids with Down syndrome can't be included, and they're in these self-contained classes, which they visit the regular classes, but they're not really part of the regular classes.
Yeah.
And lumped into them, I guess, is broadly students with an IQ. I think the number I had was with an IQ under 50 go in those classes. And, it's kind of interesting to me that a nonverbal child with autism, they will include in a general class, but they won't include a verbal child with a very low IQ.
I think, one of the reasons for that, just getting away from the question, maybe the families, the families may want that. Some families feel very strongly they want that special extra,
Some do, but not all. In fact,
not all.
The classes here are fed by many different districts. So we have this really interesting situation where there's occasionally a child from another district who, if they lived in our district, would be included. But because they don't live in our district, the only way they can attend the school with the fabulous therapists and has to be in this class. And that's a ridiculous,
that is ridiculous,
political boundary kind of thing. But it's the way the funding goes.
Wow. That's crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it is. And I would say it's the parents, I would say it's the teachers, it's the administrators, but to have that kind of division within a school is really odd. I do think that including somebody with very severe disabilities, not saying that Elon has very severe disabilities, is easier in terms of educational goals and objectives. Because, for instance, the sixth graders can be doing a social studies report on the history of, Kilimanjaro or something. And Jacob's part in that can be a physical therapy goal where he's holding the poster. He doesn't actually have to do the writing or the research. But if you have somebody with, maybe mild cognitive impairment, it's a little more difficult. I'm not saying it's difficult, and I think they should be able to do it, but it's a little more difficult for the teacher to try to, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Differentiate the instruction with kids who are a little closer.
Right.
Ultimately, I think sometimes it comes down to people just don't want to do the work, which is really sad. I do think that when I look at this question, a lot of districts call mainstreaming inclusion, and mainstreaming is, I define it as the person goes to the general ed classroom for the things they don't need support for. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, you go to the resource room for reading, but you stay gen ed for math because you're fine in math. That's mainstreaming. That's not inclusion. Inclusion means getting what you need in the general ed community,
Exactly.
getting all the support you need. So, yeah.
Okay, let's see what's, class, while we're switching slides, does anybody have a question or something they want to ask or share? Again, you can chat, you can interrupt.
I guess I'm curious to know, hi, it's me, Nicole.
Hi.
I'm curious to know for both of you, if in the classrooms, in the general education classrooms that your children were in, were there multiple special needs students within that general education class, or were they the only ones?
For my son, you want me to go first? You want to go first?
You go.
Okay. For my son, he was the only one with with significant needs. There were other students in the class who had speech and language, learning disabilities, mild cognitive impairment, maybe on the autism spectrum, although that wasn't as common back when he was in school, and other things like that. But most of them went to the resource room. They weren't included the way my son was.
And for me, it's interesting, in our district, all the elementary schools have inclusion classrooms, but the school I picked is the only one where every single classroom is an inclusive class. So, and that was the choice of the principal, that rather than put 8 kids with some kind of disability in the same class and call it the inclusion class, he wanted every class to be an inclusion class. And I think that was huge. So in elementary school, his year has a record number of students with disabilities. And, I know there's been some speculation. I found out I was pregnant with him on 9/11, and it just seems like in my school and his school, they break the record books in that year.
Really? Oh, that's just fascinating.
And I don't know. You can find anything on the internet, so I have found say that.
Yeah, but stress definitely affects pregnancy. That's really interesting.
And the dust in New York City. We were living in New York City at the time. So it's interesting when he went, and in middle school, the model is a little bit different. They use the collaborative class model. So there's only 1 or 2. All of a sudden, the school went from having 60 kids to 300 kids, and now they have 1 or 2 what they call collaborative classes on each grade level. And now he is in a class with 8 or so kids, 8 to 10 kids with disabilities. At this point, they're because all these kids have been included. It's not as hard, I think, as the collaborative classrooms we see in the city, where it's usually a 60-40 split, and there's some pretty difficult behaviors. But I do know that, kids who he was in elementary school with and kids my other son were in elementary school with who had, pretty impulsive behaviors, as my son did also in kindergarten. My son had a personal aide through 3rd grade and then a halftime aide through 5th grade, partly because he couldn't sit and he would run and he would throw and he would knock things over. But all of those behaviors are gone. And I've seen the kids who came through the elementary school. There was a boy in my other son's 2nd grade class who used to run around and put tacks in other kids. A little scary, but, I had to keep convincing my son he was a great kid anyway. Very pro-inclusion, no make a big deal about it. I didn't really want him to ever come home with a tack in his back. But even that kid has settled down and is a productive member of the middle school. And I think what happens with these kids when they're given the chance to learn and they're given the support, something clicks and they buy into just doing the right thing. I mean, I see it all the time. I have a 7th grade boy who came into my class this year. My school separates by ability. So I have the low 7th grade math group, which I took. I'm the math coordinator. I programmed the math department, and I gave myself the most difficult group of kids. And everyone said to me, "Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that?" And I said, because I want people to know that I had a choice and I'm choosing them, because I don't want anyone to be afraid to have these kids. So I have one boy whose brother was expelled from our school last year, and he came in and I walked into the class the first day and he was doing chin-ups on the door leading into the classroom. And I just decided, my first goal in that class, and there are a bunch of problems, but was just to get that kid back on track. Look, it happened to be a very good day today. But, I've just kind of been focusing on that, and I have a support person in the classroom. And I've just, it just comes down to finding a few things that they can do and do well. People were saying, look at his IQ, look at his IEP. He can't do 7th grade math. And I looked at his IEP and it didn't look nearly as scary as my own son's. Got a 90 on the first math test. And today was the first day that he sat for, I'd say, 30 minutes and did the right thing. So we started with 5 minutes a couple of weeks ago. I said, his name's Jacob, actually. I said, if you can sit for 5 minutes, like, I'll be so proud of you. Just do these 2 math problems. And you know what? Once you start working toward what the kid needs and get some, and for us, it's a very informal behavior plan. But, I think I've got him. I think he is working and he's proud. And, it seems almost too simple. And, in my case, it did take a couple of little bit of juggling with the other kids and getting some extra support in the classroom. But, I think what happens when these kids start learning and start seeing that they can do well, those behaviors diminish. So by the time they get to middle school in this district, there are really no behavior problems. I mean, there are tons of behavior problems, but they're not coming from kids with disabilities. They're coming from everybody else. And, when I look in and see these kids that were terrors, I mean, there was a kid, even the principal described as someone who he thought he would have to build a rubber room for when he was in kindergarten. That kid is a very upstanding middle school student now. And I think, it doesn't happen overnight, and there's tremendous amounts of behavior management they do with them. But so now there are more kids, but it's not the same thing. So I think where that question probably came from is New York City, which has basically the 60-40 model for collaborative teaching all the way down to kindergarten. And that's hard. If you have 40% of your class with significant disabilities, that's, and out of 30 kids, that's really difficult. And often,
that's, even just the term inclusion classroom is an oxymoron. That doesn't make any sense. And I just wanted to add to what you said is one of the reasons that research has shown that kids with more significant behavior difficulties do better in inclusive settings is because they have better models of behavior. You take a bunch of kids who, in Michigan, we call them emotionally impaired. I don't know what you call them in New York. And you have an emotionally impaired classroom, and you put all these kids with all these difficult behaviors together. Where are they going to learn good behaviors from? They're just going to learn each other's, rotten behaviors. So, but if you put them in an inclusive setting, they see the models of more typical behavior, and they're more likely to live up to that model.
So I think we kind of answered this question. It's funny, the more times we do this, the more we seem to answer the questions before they even come up. In what ways has inclusion expanded life's possibilities for your son, for other families you've consulted with?
I can speak to the second one. I think I've already talked about how he has friends everywhere. He has the support he needs. And we've kept the inclusive life for him so that he has a support system that works pretty well. I don't know that I feel that if we died, everything would continue to be perfect, because I probably spend a good 10 hours a week on dealing with stuff from Jacob's house in terms of scheduling and just caregiver schedules. And, you get 13 girls all together, working together. There's drama. It's college age girls, but so there are some things we have to deal with, and the house needs fixing, and these appointments need to be made. But we're hopeful that we're setting it up in a way that we're getting closer and closer to a model where if something happened to us, he would be able to stay there and be okay. In terms of other families, I consulted with a family when their son was 5 years old, and this is a woman I knew through some other means, and her son had actually, I think it was pretty similar to Elon in terms of his where he is on the spectrum. And so she asked me to come with her, because this was just a few years after we had fought for Jacob to be included in kindergarten. She wanted him to be in kindergarten with a full-time aide. She asked me to come with her, and she had gone through, we have something called Partners in Policy Making. I don't know if that's something you have in New York or not, but it gets parents to become better advocates for special education, teaches them how. She brought all her paperwork, and we sat down with the principal and all these teachers, and she was ready for this big fight. And they just said, sure, we'll do that. We always laugh about it, how she was all geared up for this big fight, and they just did it. Her son was the homecoming king at the high school when he was a senior. And when I heard that, I was just astounded, because I thought, wow, he really did very well. He's he must have kind of overcome his difficulties and become popular and everything. But then I went to his graduation party, and he was still, you can still tell he was very much on the spectrum. He was a little bit echolalic, and he had some social difficulties. So they didn't elect him homecoming king because he was the most popular track star or anything like that. They just loved him. It was just amazing to me. This kid with significant disabilities became homecoming king, which is usually such a social, such a negative thing. When you think about when I went to high school, we hated all those people because they were so popular. But that these inclusive settings are making the other kids more empathetic, sensitive, friendly, just making them nicer people. I think it makes everybody nicer if you understand differences and welcome them.
Let's see. Oh, here's a nice picture.
This is Heather. Heather no longer works with Jacob. She just got married, but we miss her a lot. She saw Jacob was making this face, so she made the face too and took a selfie as if, they both meant to do it on purpose. So that's one of my favorites.
Okay, here's a long one. There's a tendency for society to view disability in a rather negative light, the so-called deficit model. In addition, disability is often viewed as at least an unwanted challenge, if not an undeniable tragedy. From the first I met you nearly 20 years ago, I sensed mainly pride and excitement in your voice when you spoke of your son. How do you reconcile this with the messages you receive from society? How do you think this negativity, I can't see that because is allowed to persist.
Why do you think it persists?
And how can teachers turn this right here into a perspective that is more optimistic? And I want to add one other thing that I don't think I ever told you. I might have mentioned it to my class, but I went to Iowa over the summer to this Disability Studies and Education conference, and we heard a very interesting talk by Norman Kunk. Are you?
Oh yeah.
And
Kuntz, Norman Kuntz.
Kuntz. Okay.
Kuntz. It's pronounced Kuntz. Yeah.
Okay. So he's a man with a disability, he has cerebral palsy, and he did the keynote address. And one of the interesting things he said, now my kids were with me, number one, because I tend not to leave them, but number two, I was presenting about the book about their elementary school, and they presented with me. What surprised me was that they insisted on going to every single session, so much so that I offered to pay for them at the end, and they told me, never mind. So we heard this man speak, and he said that one of the most interesting paradoxes about disability is that most people with a disability, if you ask them if they would give up their disability, would say, no, I would not give up my disability. And he said, and then he thought about it himself, and he said, you know what, he wouldn't give it up either. And he gave his reasons why, because for him, well, now it's his career, and he said he couldn't be such a powerful advocate if he wasn't also a disabled person. And that's so much a part of his identity, he couldn't see giving it up. So it was just kind of interesting. So I asked my kids on the way home from the conference what their favorite talk was, and they all said that he was their favorite. And I asked why, and
he's really funny for one thing.
And they said my son brought up my son Elon, who has, I guess in a way they both have a disability. My little one is epilepsy, my older one is on the spectrum, and he said, I thought that was really interesting that people wouldn't want to give up their disability. And then he said, I'd give up my disability. This is the one, who struggles in school, who has, who's on the spectrum. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, it makes me feel stupid every day. And then my little one, who has epilepsy, which I would give up. It doesn't seem to have anything positive. It's landed him in the hospital twice. It gives him seizures. In school, thank God he's fine. He has no academic issues. And he turns to me and he says, I don't think I'd give up my epilepsy. And I said, you're kidding me. And he said,
wow.
No, because I think it makes my mind kind of interesting, and it makes me different. And I just thought that was so interesting, because I see my older son's disability is so part of who he is. I mean, he is on the spectrum. He's perseverative. He flaps. He looks at everything upside down and right side up. It's so part of who he is. I could never separate it from him. And for that reason, I wouldn't give it away. But my little one, what do I need these seizures for? And, it's interesting, but because, and even though he said, and then he said, well, he has certain restrictions in gym, especially after he has a seizure, he can't be more than 2 feet above, blah, blah, blah. He says, well, I don't like that so much. Yet he chose to hold on to it. Anyway, so I just put that out there. And
that's interesting. I think I've asked myself this question a million times. Would I give up Jacob's disability? Jacob is amazing, an amazing person the way he is. And if he did not have his disability, he wouldn't be the same person. So I don't think I'd give it up. What I would wish I could give up is all the pain he's gone through in terms of medical surgery, foot pain, back pain, all the things he's had to have cut open and pulled out. And, he's had tons of surgeries. I would love to have taken that from him, the medical stuff. My husband often says he doesn't wish Jacob didn't have a disability because Jacob made his career. He has a Charge Syndrome Research Lab. He just took 11 students to Australia to go to the Charge Syndrome Conference. All of his research is on Charge Syndrome. It's really driven him to make things better for people like Jacob. But ultimately, I look at Jacob, and when he's not in pain, which right now he's in a little bit of pain, but when he's not in pain, he's a very happy person. His disability doesn't make him unhappy. So this is Jacob's this isn't Jacob's graduation party. This is his younger brother's graduation party. So Jacob was about 21 here, and all of these girls who had left came back to see him for the party. So the one on the left of him with in the orange is April, who's the inclusion teacher. The one on the far right with the blonde hair and the black dress is the one who designed his Jacob Can logo. And they're just all really special people. They're all married and have kids now, so it's been quite a while. And one of the really hard things about hiring college students is after 3 years they leave and we have to start over and we have to retrain. We're constantly training new people, constantly trying to teach deafblind methods. It's difficult, but what I love about the college students is they're enthusiastic. They want to be there. They want to learn. They want to make things better for Jacob. A lot of them are special ed majors or rec therapy majors or physical therapy. We have a physical therapy doc student right now working with him, and they want to try things with him. And that just keeps his life so exciting. It's not dull. It's not like he's in a group home and just left in his bed all day. So you can just see by the looks on their faces how much they love him. They really do love him.
You could see by the look on his face how
Yeah.
happy and he is.
Well, who wouldn't be with all those pretty girls?
Well, here's a biggie, which also we've kind of tapped on.
We kind of have done that, yeah.
Okay.
There's April at her wedding. This is the same one who's a special ed teacher now, the inclusion teacher, and she just loves that picture. And she posts on Facebook constantly how Jacob was her biggest teacher at college, and he's one of her best friends. She calls him her best friend, and she just loves him. She just loves him, and she'd work with him even for no pay, I think. I think she'd just volunteer.
Okay, again, we kind of covered those. And this is just a funny one to end.
Yeah, this was done at one of the Charge Syndrome conferences where we brought a bunch of people with us, and yeah.
So let me, what time is it? Let me open it up to the class. Say we have another 10 minutes with you, and then we'll let you go to bed. Okay, so if anyone has questions for Nancy or for me, and then we're going to let Nancy go at 15, and we can stay on a little longer and talk about the next couple of weeks. But this would be a great time, for you all to jump in and ask some questions. I'm going to stop the share so we can see each other. Again, you can type, you can speak. Dan, are you about to say something? I think you just unmuted.
No, I've always been here.
No. Do you want to say something? I noticed that.
It's interesting because so I read your book last week, and listening to you guys talk, this is very much like the parent's perspective, right? And like the perspective of an advocate. And as somebody who's about to be professionally working with children, with these kinds of disabilities, like I'm actually kind of interested in that perspective, because in the classrooms that I work in now, all the IEPs that I have are specifically for learning disabilities. So I've never actually worked in a classroom as a teacher with somebody who has that level of disability that I would actually have to have let's say, I mean, obviously not a professional awareness, but like how would I cope, right? Like, so I actually haven't seen any material or heard any discussion about what sort of coping methods, right? Because it's very interesting for me to hear your guys' perspective, because I feel like often in these conversations, you almost never hear what the parents think or say or feel or what their experience is. And I think that's absolutely valuable. But like, from my perspective, like it's almost like I feel like I'm being asked to do something that I have almost no kind of idea of how I would even cope with that. Like, especially as, like, I work in a selective school now, but I'm obviously not going to be doing that. I'm not going to be hired straight into a selective school my first year teaching. And so I feel like I'm probably going to be dealing with issues like this on a real regular basis, but I have almost no idea what that's going to look like from a teacher's perspective. So
that's a really common concern. I want to preface this by saying that I'm a school psychologist also. So I'm not just, I actually teach psychology at a college now, but I practice as a school psychologist. So I got the special ed stuff down,
Sure.
Just so you know, I'm that kind of consultant as well. So I have had the professional hat on and dealt with IEPs and parents and teachers and special ed teachers. So I've had all that. So I kind of come at it from both sides, which is interesting. I think one of the things to remember when you have this fear, and it's been an experience of several of Jacob's teachers, is that these are just people first.
Sure.
And, there are very specific methods for teaching people with learning disabilities, people with cognitive impairments, and even people with on the spectrum. But usually, at least in Michigan, every one of our districts has an autism consultant that comes in and helps with that. My son is deaf-blind. That's a little different, but every state has a deaf-blind consultant
that
gives you resources and trains you also. So hopefully there are resources for whoever, you would have. But I've had several general ed. Are you general ed you're going into?
Yeah.
Okay.
ELA teacher.
Okay. So, every kid is going to come attached to a special ed teacher in some way.
Oh, okay.
So the special ed, at least in my state, the special ed teacher is there to give you that support. That's what they're there for. They're supposed to work with you to help you figure out what to do.
Right.
But a lot of teachers, Jacob had, his 5th grade teacher, for example, wrote a letter, an addendum to the IEP saying he didn't think that his classroom was the best place for Jacob and all these reasons why. And it came from a place of fear from him. About 3 weeks into school, he stopped me in the hallway and said, I was wrong. He said, I saw Jacob go up and get a drink out of the drinking fountain independently the other day, and I realized he's just a kid like the rest of the kids, and there's nothing to be afraid of. So, a lot of it is just getting to know the person as a person, as an individual first.
Sure.
And then rely on your consultants.
Right. So that's probably like a big piece of it that I'm sort of missing, because I've never worked in a classroom where we had that. For the most part, if we had like a co-teacher, it's usually for ESL issues. So, and that doesn't actually bother me or intimidate me, but I'm just like, the idea that there's this expectation without any kind of like preparation or training, that kind of bothers me, that the program that I'm in right now doesn't really seem to address that in any way, shape, or form, other than here's this idea that you have to accept.
Well, hopefully, in our class, I know, the first couple of sessions are really kind of giving you the legal background and kind of the attitude and opening, because I think that without that, there's really nothing else anyone can do. But, our session the time before last was on co-teaching. We're going to have another session on co-teaching, which, hopefully opens you to the kind of interaction that can happen between you and a special ed teacher who comes into your classroom.
Sure.
And then we also will have 4 days on differentiation of materials, and that hopefully will leave you with some more ideas as to how you can, take a skill and approach it in 4 or 5 different ways and use those ways to draw in students of different learning style. And what you're going to realize, I think, in the end is that all these techniques not only will make you more effective with kids with disabilities, but will also draw in everybody in your class, because there's a huge range of learners who do not have formal disabilities. And it turns out if you differentiate and if you follow the principles of universal design, you're going to have a classroom that runs much better for everybody.
Oh, yeah.
And the same with co-teaching. I hope we kind of covered that already. Like the co-teacher, in their case, they will be a special ed teacher, but it's really best if they're there for everybody and they're not strictly for the kids with issues. And just as Nancy said, I think the most important thing is, I've been working as an inclusive educator for 7 years now with kids, with fairly serious disabilities. I had a child last year who came with her a one-to-one. She had a whole complex series of neurological issues. She was not really verbal. She used an iPad, and every kid is just completely different. There's no one approach that's going to work for different kids. You just have to get to know the child. And sometimes it takes, maybe spending a lunch or coming in early or finding some time when you can sit down with them, like my, little chin-up boy. I've met with him countless times already outside of class just to get to know him and just to talk about how he could do better and to just get to know him as a person and see what I can do to help him succeed just a little. Because once kids start to succeed a little, and that doesn't mean be on grade level, but just make some progress, it's addictive, and they want to keep doing it. And, I think that's a huge part of it as well.
And I think also, what you said about learning about each kid individually, I think you might also find that other than some really specific things like, tube feeding, giving breathing treatments, doing sensory integration techniques, learning Braille, stuff like that, you're going to find that most kids learn in generally a lot of the same ways. And so what you'll find works for a kid may be really intuitive once you get to know them.
Sure.
So it's not there aren't a lot of real special tricks, I guess is what I'm saying. Does that make sense, Diane?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, even, I've taught so many kids now on the spectrum, and I've met so many kids on the spectrum, and they are as different from each other as any two kids in a class can be. And,
the special education system has done a really good job of making gen ed teachers feel incompetent when you really have all the skills you need in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And in some cases, at least 10 years ago when we were starting out, some of the general ed teachers could get my son to do things that none of the special ed teachers would dare to. And it's a different system now. You're being educated in a completely different way. So, special ed teachers are now clued into this whole idea of inclusion. But when my son was first diagnosed, I found when he was around special educators, all they saw were his deficits. And when he was around a general educator who didn't know that he was being perseverative, they just thought he was brilliant because he knew everything there was to know about the wheel of a subway. So.
And by the same token, when my son was in the severe disabilities classroom, they saw him a certain way. And when he went into the inclusive setting in his neighborhood school where nobody there had ever worked with anybody at his level before, they got real innovative. And it was really fun to watch them come up with things that, the people who had worked with kids with severe disabilities forever would never have thought of. And he really excelled because of that in that program.
The other thing I've noticed at my school, and something you said about, the child saying, why isn't he sitting at the table? It's amazing what kids can do for each other. And when you let go a little as a teacher and let the students come in, there's a teacher who's going to be video conferencing in with us from my son's school, and she loves to tell this story, but I'm going to tell it first because it fits. She did not think she could handle my son. She didn't know what to do with him. She was very scared. And when she had him in second grade, very early on in the year, they were doing something where they were making a loom on a loom. They were the pot holder. My son still cannot tie his shoes, and he's 14. So the thought that he could actually weave this pot holder was just beyond any goal he had. So she made up a whole other assignment for him where he was supposed to count all the different yarns and make a bar graph. How many blue, how many red, how many yellow. And he looked at it and he threw it on the floor and basically said, I'm not doing this. And she got a little ruffled, and she tried to show him how to use the loom. That of course he couldn't use the loom. He can't tie his shoes. He can't button his shirt. Look at his OT goals. She walked away. She needed a little break. She went to help some other students. She came back and my son was weaving. Beautiful pot holder he made. And she came back and she said, how did you learn how to do that? And the girl next to him said, "Wasn't that hard, Miss Richmond? I just showed him." I still have no idea how this girl, I wish she had shown him how to tie his shoes, but then again, my husband can't tie his shoes, so it's kind of a family thing. How did she get him to weave this? We don't know. It's kind of a mystery, but these things happen when you as a teacher let go and step back. When you take a kid who's not getting it and you put him in a group of kids that are, it's amazing what can happen. In fact, as a teacher, I think that's even more powerful than when the top special ed people come into my classroom or when the school psychologist stops in. It's when I can pair kids up in a way where they help each other that the really incredible things happen.
And it creates what we call in the inclusion world a community of caring. The whole community cares about each other. You know, there's less drama in that classroom. You know, people are caring about each other and helping each other all the time in that little community, because you're allowing that to happen instead of separating people.
And it was a real turning point for this teacher, and she'll probably tell the same story, so we'll listen to her perspective. It's probably completely different. We do that all the time. But it was a turning point for her, and that we agree on, that she realized it wasn't her sole responsibility to keep my son engaged and taught, that other kids could come to a place where they can help him. And kids just find ways to help each other. They just do, in ways that are really shocking and beautiful. I had a student in 8th grade a couple of years ago with fairly severely autistic, more severe than my son is now. He had an aide because he was prone to outbursts. And one day I walked in and he was very upset, red in the face. It was the most upset I've seen him. And the aide came to tell me that the boy decided he didn't want the aide next to him in class anymore. And what was she supposed to do? She was supposed to be next to him, and he's very upset and he could have a meltdown. And, you know, I had read his IEP. He was prone to violent tendencies. He was on a bunch of drugs to control violence and yada, yada. But I looked at this boy, and maybe because I'm a parent, I looked at him and I saw my son in a few years. And I saw a boy who wanted to be on his own in my class. And I told the aide to go sit in the back of the room and that we were going to see how it goes. Because to me, at that moment, his need for independence was more important than protecting anyone from an outburst or whatever might happen. And he calmed down. That was enough to calm him down. And what happened was, when he dropped his pencils, when his eraser shavings went all over the place, when his water spilled, the whole class rushed in to help. And you know what? Nobody did any worse that year because of the extra time they spent helping him, and the aide sat in the back. And this boy learned that he could be on his own in a class.
And he could rely on other people around him.
Yeah.
To help.
And he just became more of an integral part of that class. And he went on the next year to pass the algebra regents with an 84. It's very exciting. Other questions?
I was just wondering, there's a lot of positives to inclusion and a lot of good that the students can have communicating together and working together. However, did you ever experience any bullying in your son's classroom or community?
Me?
Either of you.
I can tell you that if it happened, he wouldn't have known it because he was deaf and blind. But I did hear one story about, so he had a really close friend who was in his circle of friends, and her brother was walking down the hall with a kid who was new at the school in 6th grade, and Jacob would have been in 4th grade. And this family went to our church as well, so we'd known them since they were little. So this other boy who was new looked at Jacob and pointed and said, "Look at that freak." And the other boy, who was the brother of the girl in Jacob's circle, said, "That's not a freak, that's Jacob, don't call him that." That's the only thing I've ever heard of. He's so well known in our community that people don't even stare anymore. I mean, all his life we've been stared at. It's just something you get used to as a parent with somebody with a severe disability in a wheelchair. And there's always people staring and kids going, "What's wrong with them, Mom?" And we're so well known in the community that people don't even stare. They just smile when they see him. I think that because of that community of caring, he was protected from that more than a lot of kids. So that's my experience. Have you, Diane?
It's interesting, and we have not experienced any bullying. We are in a community that has bullying problems, so it was something I was always aware of. In elementary school, because almost every day the message was sent to the students, look around, talk to everybody, talk to Elon, involve him. And he had this nice, robust group of friends who actually were kind of the top of the class. I mean, his best friend was class president in 5th grade. So he was in with the cool kids and never had a problem. When he went on to middle school, I was very nervous. He was on a bus, a different bus than his group of friends were on. There were two older students in the neighborhood, and every day I would ask them, does anyone bother Elon on the bus? Is everything? And they would always say, everything's fine, everything's fine. And Elon would know if someone was bullying him. So he has never been bullied. In fact, one time, the first time, they have a couple of buses coming home. So one bus comes right at the end of the day, and then there's another bus 40 minutes later in case you want to stay for activities. So one day, almost every day for 2 years, he was on the early bus, and I would wait for him. And, looking outside my window, or I would have someone here. Some days a week I was home for that bus. Some days a week I wasn't. So one day he was not on the bus, and two kids from the bus actually walked around the block to come and tell me that he wasn't on the bus, that they saw that he forgot his backpack and he ran back to get it. And they just wanted me to know. I didn't even know who these kids were. And they were exactly the kids I would worry about because they just looked a little like kind of tough and kind of cool. And in reality, my son had already texted me that he had forgotten his backpack. But I just thought, my gosh, they do look out for him. Having said that, and I spoke to Nancy about this last week, what I did notice in middle school, and now I'm a little worried about in high school, while he's not bullied, he's kind of ignored a little bit. And, he had his friends from elementary school. And I realized when at the last minute, they went off to these prestigious private schools, that he was going to be kind of alone now in high school. And I had an experience at the end of last year. My son was in the drama club. And, I felt like he really stepped out of his shell to try out to be in the play. He got a rather small part for an 8th grader, but he did it with pride and he did it well. And he went to rehearsals every day, which cost him a lot of time in terms of preparing for schoolwork. And I happened to be at the cast party because I was a parent volunteer. And throughout this 2-hour cast party, I saw him many times go up to students and try and talk to them. And he was just kind of ignored. Like either they couldn't quite hear what he was saying or they didn't really care. And that was quite painful to see. And at the same time, my 6th grader was there and he was talking to everybody. He got phone numbers of 8th grade girls. And my 8th grader was quite upset about that. And, it's opened up a big discussion in the house. Why does Aaron have more friends? Why is he more popular? And, my son said, well, just because I'm shy, why don't kids talk to me? Why don't, and it's funny because he's in a social skills group at school, but they don't really do anything outside of the group. So they tried to get him to become friends with the other kids in the group, but he's not particularly interested in those kids. So while he hasn't been bullied, it's not perfect. And I didn't really worry about it so much in middle school because he had these 3 kids from elementary school. And now that he's in high school, I have spoken to the guidance counselor and the social worker, and I'm not really sure what anyone is doing to address it. He did on his own find a couple of kids to eat with. So everyone's kind of happy about that. But
the interesting thing about that, Diane, is that's a very typical middle school experience for a lot of kids without disabilities.
That's what they told me.
It really is. I mean, that's what my whole middle school and high school experience with. I finally found a couple of girlfriends that I hung out with every day, but they were my only friends. I was just introverted and I wasn't interested in being part of a big crowd. And we had this protective shell around us, the 3 of us, and we just didn't talk to anybody else. But I think that's a pretty typical experience. And maybe your Aaron is just a little more gregarious and outgoing. And
for sure he is. He's texting 8th, 9th grade girls now.
Yeah.
I guess he is. But it's funny. That's exactly what the psychologist said to me. And I guess there's where maybe if he didn't have a disability, I wouldn't be so sensitive to it, or I wouldn't expect them to go out of their way for him.
Or you'd feel exactly the same way. You'd be upset about it and want to help him.
Right.
I mean, what I'm saying is celebrate the normalcy of that.
That's true. That's true.
On the other hand, I will say that I think that bullying depends on the situation. I think a good administrator can eliminate bullying from at least in elementary school if they have the right policies and if you have teachers that are helping everybody to embrace one another. I don't necessarily think it comes from the kids all the time, but from the atmosphere that's set up. So I think it can happen to anybody. I mean, even in Jacob's school where he was never bullied, there were kids with milder disabilities who were, you know, so it's not a perfect protection, obviously.
Other questions? I see a little message up there that a certain phone number is talking, but I don't hear anyone talking. So maybe someone's trying to talk. I see 917-331-2269 is talking, but I don't hear anything.
Hi, I'm 917-331-2269. I'm Jane. Yao Jing. Hi, teacher. Because in my home, my website doesn't work, so I use my phone to connect and do this online teaching.
Okay.
I'm really excited to listening your friend and the professor talk about the special education. Thank you. I don't know. It's a lot of information that I need to learn and to review.
Oh, good. I'm glad you've enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoy it. I listening, even though my listening is not good, but I try my best to catch every word.
I have recorded it, so I am going to hopefully get it up there by tomorrow if all goes well. Once in a while I have a little issue converting it, but it looks like it's working fine. So you can go back over it and listen again.
Oh, it's really good.
So any other questions or comments? Again, you can type them if you're more comfortable.
Really comfortable, but I don't know how to type my question.
Okay.
Maybe I will email you, and the next, maybe October 17th, I send some comment for you.
Okay. You can ask it if you want. Okay, or we can talk about it.
I can ask one question.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. In my opinion, in the U.S., a lot of the special needs students. How to judge this student is special aid student? Even though I observed at Brooklyn Technical High School, every kid just take a test, go to this high school, but there also has special needs students. And some special teacher give more actual help for them. That's why I want to be a special teacher, educator for them. I want to help them, improve their reading, writing, and another skill. Okay.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I kind of have a question / comment. I went to PS 333, which was one of the first schools in Manhattan to include children inclusively with large motor skills disabilities. So the school does continue to do that. There's a lot of children in wheelchairs, and I'm a dance teacher, so I was observing the dance teacher there. And I didn't realize this, but according to the policy, there's they have the extra support in their core curriculum, but in their specials they don't. So in dance, they have their paras there, but there's all these other issues that were going on. This one, she wasn't able to teach anything this class essentially. Maybe there was 2 or 3 kids that got something out of it, but there was one child in a wheelchair. It was second grade. One child in a wheelchair, one with a walker who also had a wheelchair, but in dance he used a walker. Then there were at least 5 other students that had IEPs. And it was so overwhelming and very destructive. There a lot of acting out and things like that.
Oh.
The paras weren't really helping because those children with the more emotional problems that were going on, they weren't their paras, so they weren't helping in the situation. And I was in the room observing. There was a student teacher there as well. So she did have a team to kind of help and step in a little bit. But it got to be a little chaotic for a while. Those 4 children were running around because they didn't have any control of their bodies. And I think if we're going to have inclusion in classrooms, it needs to be across the board, even for specials, that they have the support, especially because it's something that is not it's not a subject or a discipline that they have all the time. So the transition may be even more difficult.
Yeah, that just doesn't seem right. Each of those students should have had their individualized education program, should have addressed their specials.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those examples of things not going well due to lack of planning or lack of effort. I mean, you did say they had paras with them, but the paras weren't being effective.
Right. And in the normal classroom, there's about 5 teachers in the room.
Okay.
And for dance, there's only the one teacher.
That's a problem, and it's a problem I've heard of and I've seen even on Long Island where, you know, when kids go to music, for example, they may be up to 3 classes combined and one teacher with just the paras, but no longer the special ed support. And it's bad. And it's often it's in those subjects that even typical kids may act out a bit because it's not as serious a subject, or maybe there are so many kids that the teacher doesn't know one kid from the other. And it's a problem. It's one of those situations that makes inclusion look bad, but it's actually that it's just being done really badly. Because there's so much possibility for dance. We're going to see in a few weeks, we look at a video of these Axis, an integrated dance troupe, doing absolutely spectacular dance. And
Oh, that's cool.
you know, so I think you're just seeing an instance of really not getting enough support. And I think, you know, in a situation like that, you need to speak up. You need to go to your supervisor and you need to explain that there's just not enough support here. You know, a couple of years ago, I had an inclusive class that was up to 28 students, and I had no second teacher and I had no help. And I went to my supervisor and I said, this class is not functioning. If you think you can find one teacher who can handle them, then give that class to them and take it away from my salary, which I knew he wouldn't do. Or find me another teacher. And they found me another teacher. You know, they're always trying to save a few pennies, or they think that, you know, someone should be able to handle a group that's just unmanageable. And it wasn't the student's fault. It was 28 kids when I had, you know, 10 with special needs. It was not possible. And you have to, I know it's hard, especially if you're not tenured, but, you know, I think you have to speak up, certainly if there's a situation involved. And sometimes, you know, I just counseled a teacher at my school. She has also a way too large class with a lot of kids with issues. There's already been accidents, and I told her to walk in and say she will leave unless they find her another teacher. And I'm sure they will. They don't want a teacher to leave. But there were really dangerous things going on. And you know, I'm all for speaking up, because if an accident happens or someone gets hurt in your class, that'll be much worse. Question? Okay, yeah? Okay, so I want to let Nancy go soon because I promised her an earlier evening, and it's already, you know, but things always end up taking longer. We call her when she's on here. So, I mean, we can stay on for another couple of minutes. We can talk about the next couple of weeks. If there's one more question, or, you know, if you have a question for her that you didn't get to ask, you're certainly free to email me and I can pass it on to her, or you can ask me next week when we actually do see each other in person. So I'm just kind of scrolling through the faces here. I don't see anyone jumping to ask. Give it another minute. Oh, we got some nice smiles. So Nancy, it was awesome as always.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. So
Okay. Have a great class, everyone.
thank you. We're going to let Nancy go, and, you know, any of you who, why don't you all stay on for another minute or two? We so often are together face to face, and we'll just talk about the next few weeks. Okay. Well, first, I just want to put in another little advertisement for Zoom. It's actually free. it's free if you have under 25 participants. So I pay a monthly $14.99 so I can pull in 25 or 26 of you, and also so I can go over 40 minutes. It's free if it's under 40 minutes and under 25 students. So if you were to Zoom someone into your classroom, even if your class had 30 kids, it only counts as one, if you could just Zoom in your speaker. So it's a very nice interface for bringing in the world to your classroom. So as far as the next couple of weeks go, so the next, next Wednesday, there's no school because it's Columbus Day. Check your Hunter schedules carefully because there's no school at Hunter Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Tuesday and Wednesday are Jewish holidays. And then, so just check and make sure. I think Thursday might be a Tuesday. So I forget, but there's something going on next week with your schedule. And the following Monday, we're in person. So I switched things a little bit. We were going to do the IEP meeting, the mock IEP meeting, but I decided to move it till the next week because I think it'll be good to have an in-person session when I can kind of brief you a little bit on what we're going to be doing and show you where the materials are. So we're going to be doing an activity. We'll wrap up some points, some things from the other readings, and we'll do another kind of brainstorming activity where we'll be in groups. And I'm also going to give you a little bit of time to connect with your book groups, your book review groups, so you can start making some plans in person for how you're going to divvy up the work. And then the following week, we're going to be doing 2 rounds of groups for this IEP meeting. So that's probably about all we'll have time for that week. So I'll leave you, at least a half an hour to connect with your groups in person next week. And what else? Any other questions? So on the 24th, your first big assignment is due, this collaborative skills co-teaching project. So, you have the options laid out in the syllabus. You're free to, ask me questions about it either now or over email. Even though we're meeting in person, I'm going to open up a link on Blackboard. It's just so much easier to have things handed in that way. I can't lose anything. I don't have to go home with a big pile full of papers on the Long Island Railroad. And, it's just nice and clean. I can see that it's been turned in. There's a record of it. So, you should certainly be thinking about that at this point. If you choose the research paper option, please run the topic by me. Often, you might pick something that's very broad or very narrow, and I can kind of, I know enough about the literature out there that I can kind of take your idea and gear it towards something that is doable in that size paper. Okay, so questions or comments? Okay, so we'll wrap up. So we're going to do this one more time. I believe it's November 14th, and we're going to be joined by, it looks like we're going to have 3 teachers from the inclusive school where my kids went. One is actually a teacher of the self-contained class, so it'll be interesting to hear a little bit from her. One is actually a one-on-one who works with a student with a severe disability, and one is this 2nd grade teacher who, I've had a lot of dealings with. So, that'll be an interesting time also to get some more concrete practical advice about what goes on in a classroom from a teacher's perspective. Okay, so I'm going to wish you all a fabulous Columbus Day weekend. And if you have follow-up questions on this, just, email me and I'll get you an answer, okay? Okay, good night. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.